Imagine hiring, like a cutthroat CEO to completely dominate your competition, right? And on his very first day, he just walks into the office, puts on an apron, and starts scrubbing the break room floors.
I mean, that would be incredibly confusing.
Right. It's completely jarring. And that level of reality-breaking whiplash is exactly what we're exploring today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this one.
Same here. But before we unpack the absolute chaos of our historical sources today, I just want to warmly welcome you and offer a sincere, divine blessing for your day and your entire week.
Yes, absolutely.
May you find peace, clarity, and just immense purpose in whatever you're stepping into right now.
Which, honestly, that clarity is going to be essential today because the narrative landscape we are stepping into is, well, it's incredibly disorienting.
Oh, so our mission for this deep dive is to unpack Mark chapter 9. And to do that, we are leaning heavily on insights from two heavy-hitting study Bibles, the Holman and the NAA.
Both of which are fantastic resources for historical context.
Yeah, they really are. And we're going to use them to explore one of the most intense chapters in the text. We're talking about a central paradox here, the stark contrast between this divine, awe-inspiring glory on a mountaintop and then the messy, failure-prone human reality down in the valley.
It is the ultimate collision of the heavenly and the human. The text really refuses to let you stay comfortable in either extreme.
No, it doesn't. So let's start right at the peak. The narrative anchor here is the Transfiguration.
Right.
Jesus takes his inner circle, so that's Peter, James, and John, up a high mountain. And our study notes identify this as possibly Mount Tabor or maybe Mount Hermon.
Yeah, the exact location is debated, but the elevation and the isolation are the key parts.
Definitely. And right there in front of them, Jesus is transfigured. The text says his clothes become blindingly, unnaturally white, like practically radioactive.
Yeah, it's a great description. The word used in the original Greek for transfigured is actually the root of our modern word metamorphosis.
Oh, wow.
But it's crucial to understand the theology at play here, according to the sources. Jesus wasn't fundamentally changing into something new in this moment.
Okay, so what was happening?
Rather, his true divine nature, which had basically been cloaked in humanity, was temporarily being unveiled. It's like a peeling back of the curtain,
That makes a lot of sense.
And suddenly, he's not alone on this mountain. Two towering figures from antiquity, Moses and Elijah, just appear and are actively conversing with him.
Okay, let's unpack this because my brain short-circuits a bit here. If you're putting together a VIP mountaintop summit of historical heavyweights, why Moses and Elijah?
It does seem like an oddly specific pairing at first.
Right, like why not Abraham? He's the literal father of the faith. Or, I don't know, King David, the ultimate monarch. Elijah feels like a bit of a wild card in this specific lineup.
He really does, until you look at the structure of Jewish history. So Abraham is the patriarch, yes, but Moses represents the law.
The bedrock stuff.
Exactly, the foundational covenant of Israel established at Sinai. Elijah, on the other hand, represents the prophets. He's the relentless voice of God calling a wayward people back to that exact covenant. So by having the law and the prophets appear and converse with Jesus, it's this cosmic validation. It visually demonstrates to the disciples that Jesus isn't a break from their history. He's the ultimate fulfillment of it.
Okay, that is fascinating. He's the culmination of everything they've been taught. And then, to add to the sheer spectacle, a cloud suddenly descends and covers them all. Which, if you know the Hebrew texts, is never just like a passing weather event.
No, definitely not. A cloud is the classic, unmistakable symbol of God's presence.
The Shekinah glory, rather.
Exactly. We see this all the way back in the book of Exodus, leading the Israelites. And from that cloud, a divine voice speaks, declaring Jesus as the beloved Son.
Which has to be terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. It's a direct echo of the authority established on Mount Sinai centuries earlier. But now, the directive to the disciples is incredibly simple. The voice just says, listen to him.
So we have glowing clothes, legendary historical figures materializing out of nowhere, a supernatural cloud, and the literal audible voice of God. I mean, it is the peak spiritual experience.
It really doesn't get any higher than that.
And then there's Peter.
Oh, Peter!
I love Peter because he is so deeply, awkwardly human in these moments. He sees the fabric of reality tearing open, and he just starts babbling.
He really does?
He's like a starstruck fan who accidentally wandered backstage, sees his idols, and awkwardly tries to, build a VIP lounge for the celebrities. He blurts out, "Hey, it's good we're here. Let's build 3 tents."
It is a profoundly human reaction to overwhelming awe, though. When we encounter something utterly beyond our comprehension, our first instinct is usually to try and manage it.
Right, to put it in a box.
Exactly. But the study notes point out that Peter's comment about building tents or tabernacles wasn't completely random.
Really? I always thought he was just making zero sense.
Well, he was panicked, but it connects deeply to the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles. That was a festival where people built temporary shelters to commemorate God dwelling with them in the wilderness.
Oh, interesting. So he's desperately pulling from a religious tradition he actually knows to try and make sense of something he completely doesn't.
Precisely. He is trying to prolong this glorious experience. He wants to capture the mountaintop high, institutionalize it, and just make it permanent.
Which is so relatable.
It is, but the text is brutally honest about his psychological state. It explicitly notes that he said this because they were terrified, and he simply didn't know what else to say.
Just word vomit out of sheer terror.
Pretty much. We constantly try to put the divine in a manageable box, or in this case, a tent. But notice how the divine command from the cloud completely ignores Peter's construction plans.
Right. God doesn't say, no, Peter, use cedar wood instead.
Exactly. The voice doesn't critique his architecture at all. It just says, listen to him.
Stop building, stop managing, and just start listening. That is powerful. But the reality is, this high doesn't last. They literally have to hike back down the mountain.
And that transition is brutal.
It gives you emotional vertigo. We move from literal mountaintop glory down into the valley, and instantly we clash with human inadequacy.
You step right back into the mess.
Down below, there's this massive, chaotic crowd. Religious scholars are arguing, and right in the center is a desperate father with his son. The boy has an impure spirit that makes him deaf and mute, violently throwing him into fire and water.
It's a horrifying situation.
And the father brought the boy to the 9 disciples who stayed behind, and they completely failed to heal him.
The contrast there is sharp and entirely deliberate. You go from the perfection of the divine presence to the absolute brokenness of human suffering in a matter of footsteps.
I have to ask a pointed question here, though, on behalf of the listener. Because, wait, earlier in Mark's account, Jesus literally gave these same disciples the authority to go out and cast out demons, and they did it successfully.
They did, yeah.
So why would they suddenly lose that ability? It feels a bit like Jesus changed the spiritual rules on them without sending out a memo.
It does look like a sudden rule change, I'll admit, but the notes explain that it's actually a revelation of how spiritual authority works in this framework.
Okay, how so?
When Jesus later explains privately to the disciples why they failed, he tells them, this kind can only come out by prayer. Some manuscripts also add fasting. What this reveals is that the disciples had likely begun to rely on their past successes.
Like they were coasting.
Exactly. They were treating exorcism like a magic formula or a learned technique, neglecting the necessary spiritual preparation.
Ah, like they thought they had leveled up in a video game and unlocked a permanent skill they could just use on command.
That's a perfect analogy. They assumed the power was now an inherent property of their own resume. But in this worldview, spiritual authority isn't a battery you charge once. It's a constant, dependent connection to the source.
And by neglecting prayer, they severed that connection.
Right. They tried to confront supernatural darkness, relying purely on their own natural confidence.
Which obviously didn't work. But amidst all this theological failure, the interaction that really gets me is the one between Jesus and the desperate father.
It's one of the best moments in the book.
Jesus tells the man that all things are possible if he believes. And the father immediately cries out, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief.
That is arguably one of the most honest, resonant prayers in all of recorded history.
It is so incredibly relatable. For you listening to this deep dive right now, you likely know exactly what that paradox feels like. It's the profound, honest human struggle of desperately wanting to trust, having a fragile core of faith, but still battling massive, overwhelming waves of doubt.
He is holding absolute faith and absolute doubt in the exact same breath.
And Jesus doesn't turn the Father away for having an imperfect, fractured faith. That mustard seed of belief is enough. Jesus heals the boy right there in the dust and chaos of the valley.
Which proves the victory happens in the mess, not just in the pristine quiet of the mountaintop.
Exactly. So the boy is healed, they leave the crowds behind, and you would think the disciples are ready to learn.
You would think.
But the thematic transition here is wild. Jesus attempts to use this private travel time to explain his ultimate mission, his coming death and resurrection.
And this connects directly back to their failure in the valley.
Right. So what does this all mean? The text notes They completely misunderstood him, and they were too afraid to even ask for clarification. It's like my analogy earlier. It's like hiring a ruthless CEO to dominate the market, but on day one, he starts washing the intern's feet.
Yes, the expectations were entirely mismatched.
The disciples expected a conquering military hero to violently overthrow Rome, not a suffering servant who was going to be executed.
And because they were afraid to ask Jesus for clarification, they just fell back on human ego.
Classic human move.
As Jesus is walking ahead of them, talking about his impending death, they are literally lagging behind on the dirt road, getting into a heated argument about which one of them is the greatest.
It is so painfully tone deaf. They finally get to a house in Capernaum, and Jesus turns to them and asks, "So, what were you guys discussing on the road?"
And the room just drops into dead silence.
Oh, the silence of absolute shame. They know they're caught.
They absolutely do. But Jesus sits down, which in that era was the formal posture of a rabbi teaching with authority, and he delivers this radical object lesson. He tells them, if anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all.
And to drive the point home, he brings a child into the middle of the room. Now, to our modern ears, this sounds very sweet. We think of children as ultimate symbols of innocence.
Right, but the historical sources clarify that we cannot view this through a modern lens. In that era, a child wasn't a symbol of innocence. A child was a person with absolutely zero status or legal rights.
Really? Zero.
Zero. They were at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. So Jesus isn't giving a sentimental message here. He is completely reversing human values. He's saying that to be first, you must deliberately align yourself with the last. You must be the servant of all, specifically caring for the marginalized and those who can offer you absolutely no social capital in return.
That is a staggering plot twist on power and status, and it clearly rattles the disciples, because the theme of who is important triggers John to basically complain. He says, "Teacher, we saw a rogue outsider driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he wasn't one of us."
They are acting like spiritual bouncers.
Yes, they completely failed to cast out a demon themselves just a few days prior, but now they are aggressively shutting down someone else who is actually succeeding.
Simply because he doesn't have their specific VIP badge.
And Jesus shuts that tribalism down. He says, whoever is not against us is for us. But then he immediately pivots to a terrifying warning about causing the vulnerable to stumble.
It's one of the sharpest tone shifts in the text.
Here's where it gets really interesting, but also really dark. I have to push back a little here. Jesus says that if anyone causes one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better to have a millstone tied around their neck. And then he commands people to cut off their hands or gouge out their eyes.
Yeah, it's intense.
Isn't commanding amputation incredibly extreme for a message that was just about peace and inclusion?
It sounds horrifying, yes. But the expert analysis explains the Greek word used here, scandalizo.
Scandalizo.
Yes, it means a trap or stumbling block. The amputation language is deliberate hyperbole. Jesus isn't advocating literal self-mutilation.
Okay, phew. That is a relief.
He's using it to show the absolute life-or-death gravity of sin and of causing others to lose their faith. He's saying it is better to lose something incredibly valuable to you than to let it drag your entire self into Gehenna.
And let's contextualize that imagery, because he talks about being thrown into Gehenna hell, where the worms that eat them do not die and the fire is not quenched.
Yeah.
According to the study notes, Gehenna wasn't just an abstract concept, right?
No, it was a very real place. Gehenna refers to the Valley of Hinnom, a literal valley southwest of Jerusalem, and its history is incredibly dark.
What happened there?
In the past, it was used for horrific child sacrifices to pagan gods.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and by the time of Jesus, it had largely become a burning refuse dump for the city. It was a place of literal decay, maggots, and smoldering fires. So he's using this visceral image of historical horror and literal garbage to represent permanent destructive separation from God.
It's a stark, terrifying wake-up call.
Yeah.
But then, right at the very end of this dark discourse, we get this cryptic phrase to resolve the chapter. Jesus says, everyone will be salted with fire.
Which is notoriously difficult to unpack.
Yeah, what does that even mean? Synthesizing the notes, how do we understand salted with fire?
Well, in the ancient world, salt preserved meat from rotting, and fire was the ultimate agent of purification. So this means a purifying fire for believers. It's a call to endure trials, maintain their distinctive flavor, meaning their holiness and dedication, and, as he concludes, to live in peace with one another.
Which brilliantly circles back to where they were fighting over who was the greatest.
Exactly.
It really is a masterpiece of narrative whiplash. Briefly recapping, Mark 9 takes you on a journey that completely inverts worldly expectations. You go from the dazzling validation on the mountain to the messy reality of faith in the valley, ending with a radical redefinition of greatness as serving the lowest.
It completely dismantles the ego.
It really does. And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. The disciples literally saw Moses, Elijah, and a glowing, transfigured Jesus. Yet mere days later, they were petty, powerless, and arguing about their own resumes.
Just a humbling reality check.
It is. How often do we, too, completely miss the divine reality right in front of us because we are obsessed with our own earthly status and scorecards? Something to definitely think about. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. God blesses all the listeners. See you next time.